question for Bill.
Okay, go ahead and ask your question, and I see Jay is chomping at the bit to get in here as well.
Can I read into your question? So I don't understand, as well as living in Garden City in the mapped floodplain, I also am a taxpayer to the Flood Control District 10 because I'm close to the river. So why isn't there a Flood Control District 9 upstream? I mean, as we saw in those inundation maps, they've got a serious flood problem, you know, in a lot of areas from Lucky Peak down to basically where I live in Garden City. And so, Bill, I'm curious if that, you know, why there isn't, because I don't want to sound totally stupid at saying maybe there should be, because maybe there's some good reason why there isn't.
Bill, well, as you answer that question, why don't you give us a little bit of background on Flood District 10 and 11 and what they do, and then answer Liz's provocative question.
I don't know. Flood District 10, Flood District 11 go from where Barger Matson is by Plantation Golf Course, is where Flood District 10 starts. And it stops just upstream slightly from the bridge in Caldwell, where the interstate crosses the river. Flood District 11 goes from there to the confluence. We have, we tax those folks that are adjacent to the river. We don't get any tax money from all you folks that built houses and asphalt and everything else up on top and send us your water, which I think is something we need to consider as far as that. I got on the board because my uncle was on the board, and he was one of the first, he was the first commissioner for the area. And I've never heard about Flood District 9 unless it's in another part of the state. It's in Blaine County.
Somewhere else in the state.
Yeah. And I would assume the reason that there is not a flood district is that the cities felt that they could handle it, would be my thinking. It was kind of interesting to me listening to the numbers Jay's talking about. Flood Control District 10, Flood Control District. Interesting thought. Who controls a flood? Nobody controls a flood. Flood Control District 10 is really flood maintenance district. We help when it's flooding because we have pretty good expertise on the river, but our function is maintenance. We have a budget in the million, no, excuse me, our budget is $230,000, period. In a year last year, when we really didn't have the ability to do anything in the river because of some permitting issues, we spent over $90,000 doing projects in the river. We helped with the fight during the flood, and I think very instrumental in helping with the Corps and with Ada County Highway District about STAR. But really our function right now is all those beautiful trees out there are falling into the river. And our function is to provide flood conveyance. I've always wondered, because I sat next to him in one of these panels, a professor that talked about underground storage. Micron has it. I think there's a possibility for it. I suggested it to the governor one time when I was sitting across from him. He looked at me and he said, now about those dams. And that was the sum total. But it's something I understand possibly out in Mountain Home area. If we could put that water down, and it would be a storage facility for us like the mountain snow is, it could provide both flood control issues as well as water supply issues. Flood District right now, for everyone's knowledge, has asked for a 5 years maintenance program. We want a permit to work in the river. It is presently on the website with the Corps. We're looking for comments. We would really appreciate comments now rather than when we're closer to the time that we need to have a decision made. We respond to when people ask, have problems with bank stability, whatever. Question was asked, you know, what would we do with extra money? Being an old helicopter pilot, you know, I can envision getting a bunch of helicopters in here and lifting trees out of the way. The mayor had a nice, horrible situation this spring that you may or may not heard, of when a tree that we had tried to get out, that we didn't get the opportunity to do it, tore up his water supply coming across the river and created major havoc. People think of, well, let's just take the trees down. They say, just get them cut up, get firewood. You have to realize that most of the property that we are dealing with is private property, number one. And if you look at some of these trees and the size of the roots, someone with his skills chainsaw isn't going to be cutting it up real easy. So flood district is a small unit. We have a number of folks helping us. We need your support. We need to consider expanding the funding opportunities. I think of all the major stuff. Question other was what tools available. I think this is really fun. Drive State Street, get out of the main development, and look at where the houses that were built in the 30s and the 40s are. Then look at the houses that have been built in the last 10 years. My house is, I live down on the river bottom. My house is three-quarters of a mile from the river, probably. I mean, everybody put their houses far away from the river because they knew it was going to flood. It wasn't a matter of if, but it was when. Today we have houses that are there that we now have to protect. And so what would other thing that I like to see happen is we allow big flushes in the river. In 97, I think it was 97, January, the river was put at 6,000 or 7,000 feet. We had that for almost 4 or 5 months. Amazing what Mother Nature can do if you let her do it. And I would love to see a situation where we have big snowpacks and the opportunity to where we could have high flushes. When we had Boise River 2000, a bunch of us started a number of years ago, a developer came up to me and he said, just give me a number. And I said, what kind of number do you want? He said, tell me what number that I can work with. If it's 7,000 in the river, if it's 10,000, but tell me what it is, and then I'll build my subdivision accordingly. So, you know, that was kind of interesting to me, because if we put everything at 10,000 feet, then we get a lot of houses out of the way for a long time. Does that answer? Sorry, no flood district 9 here in Boise.
Don't you think it would be helpful if we could tax those people as well and get some more money into dealing with this problem?
I got to be really political here.
It's just an option.
It amazes me. Well, let me just say that the river through Boise is a lot cleaner than it is every place else. Is that, can I say that, Dave?
Yeah.
And I'm not going to, I'll leave it at that. Okay.
When you say clean, you mean there's less debris that might be a problem in a flood?
Correct, yeah. And, and people must realize there's so many people wanting to do so many things with this river. And I always say when people come to visit Boise, you talk about the foothills, but people go to the river. Very quick story. We're working on the south and the north channel, and I was talking to a guy from I love catch and release trout and fish, honest. He's a fishing organization, and he calls me and he's screaming at me. And the long and short of it, he didn't want us to deal in the north channel. But then he said he wanted us to chain logs into the river for more habitat. And I suggested that, what about the rafters and the kids that might get hung up in the chains? And he finally said, you're just one of those bait fishermen. Enough.
The worst insult that could have been. Bill, why don't you pass the mic on down to the other end here? I'd love to hear from Jay and the mayor. You were making that observation about where people used to build their houses. My wife Karen and I were having dinner at Cafe Vicino the other day, where they have an old photograph of the city of Boise, and by golly, the houses are a long way from the river. People did seem to have some sense of the risk back in those days, but
And they didn't have subsidized, very, very cheap insurance.
That's certainly true, and I'm anxious to hear from the mayor and from Jay. Jay, you've got the mic in your hand. Tell us a little bit of your reactions to this conversation.
No, I wanted to mention a couple of things that we've danced around a couple of the issues. And number one, to point blank answer, wetlands are not a very good idea for volume storage. They're great. They're great for aesthetics. They're great for what they do in treating the water quality issues. But you have to manage the wetlands to be within, the water level needs to stay within 18 inches of the roots, basically, or 18 inches of the ground, because the wetlands are delineated by the species of plants. The water level goes too low, those plants die out. Therefore, if you were to put, let's say, wetlands at the bottom of a lake or a bottom of a dry reservoir, they would, if they had a water source, they would stay and remain. But if they filled up with a flood and you didn't empty it, then they would die, may not repopulate for a while. It's not a good idea, and so you really can't use them for volumetric storage. And that moves into the issue that needs to be brought out, and that is, I'm going to tell you a tale of two cities, San Antonio, Texas, and Austin, Texas. In the early 50s, San Antonio, when they developed, they built huge concrete channels, and they were expensive, and they were really quite ugly and unattractive, certainly. Where Austin, being a college town, built nothing, literally nothing. They let the water drain naturally, and everything was cool until they got some of the big Texas storms that do occur, and they decided that they would build then storage. Storage and conveyance are two separate things, and they have two very different effects and impacts. And you need to keep in mind what you're trying to do. Conveyance is far better for transporting water from point A to point B. Storage just delays the problem from occurring. For instance, in California, the Central Valley are building levees to a 200-year event. If you build storage to a 100-year storage and you get a 200-year storm, that compounds and you end up having to discharge water, and you have any problems with the dam, you no longer have even 100-year storage. You may have lost the whole valley. And it's very important to keep in mind that storage is a delayer of the ultimate event, and conveyance is the better way from an engineering standpoint. I'm not going to argue the merits of having a beautiful green belt, but certainly a beautiful green belt with setbacks and a type of trees that are not choking the channel from a management standpoint is wise to do, and that is obviously the ultimate goal. But what do you do when you have an urban area? That's when you don't have much choice. You look at storage. Why? Because it's a remediation. It's a remedial option, and it only works part of the time. Okay, going back to the story with San Antonio and Austin. San Antonio didn't flood all that much. Why? Because they provided large, ugly concrete channels that conveyed the water through the city. Now, the kind of flow rates that they got in San Antonio, the San Antonio River started 5 miles north of the city limits of San Antonio, and by the time it got to the bottom of San Antonio, the 100-year discharge was 135,000. It wasn't 20,000, it was 135,000. And then they had two creeks on either side of the San Antonio River that had 75,000 CFS discharges for the 100-year. I know I was the drainage engineer for the city of San Antonio for 4 years. Austin didn't have anywhere near that kind of capacity. So when stormwater became a quality issue, Austin was sitting pretty because it had all these wonderful captured water where they could treat it, meter it out, and make it work. San Antonio couldn't do that. They had no storage within the city. Again, the issues, you see how two cities that approach things differently end up in two different locations. The point is the community needs to make sure that they are backing the method that you're going to use. If you use storage as a method, then by all means go for it. But understand what it gives you. It doesn't give you nirvana. It does not give you. I would never live underneath a dam. I'm sorry, I'm a drainage engineer. I mean, what would you expect? I don't buy homes that are in floodplains. I don't even buy homes that are close to floodplains. I don't. If the Boca Stampede combination reservoirs in Truckee were to let go, and one of these days it will, we're in earthquake country. As you know, California is one of the nasty ones, the nasty zones. It would put Reno 30 to 40 feet of water. That would cover all the area. And so just keep in mind that when you start looking at these solutions and what it means and how it works. So with that, I'll let the mayor-
So Jay, would you put a levee right out there where I'm pointing along the Boise River? What would you do if we hired you to come to our city and fix this problem? What would you do to us?
My board asked me if I could build the flood project for $500 million and talk about sticking your neck out. I actually said yes. What would I do? I don't know. I think you need to do some cost-benefit looks at how much money it would take to fix this building. I'm just going to say this building and leave the rest of the developed area alone. I would look at how much it would cost to fix this building, and if it turns out that it was cheaper to fix this building on a 10-year basis, I would then collect that money, put it in a bank somewhere, let it collect interest, and I would leave the aesthetics alone, because look at this, it's beautiful. Why do anything to it? Can you raise this building? Technically, it cost you about $30 or $40 million to do that. That's kind of ridiculous. You can put a big fat wall along here, and that wouldn't look very nice either. You wouldn't have all this beautiful. So I would look at other non-structural types of options, maybe finding ways to fund some of the cleanup and just living with it, putting it into account so that you can do that. I'm just saying that you'll have to look at different paradigms, and things change. I love what Liz was saying. I've been an advocate of control and wise usage of water, always have been. But I think the thing I want you to leave you with is water usage from the standpoint of domestic and irrigation. It's an order of magnitude smaller than a flood event. Flood events are 30,000 CFS. You use 100 CFS, 20 CFS off the water. You're pulling that out and you're treating that and you're putting it in your distribution system. The irrigators, we have about 20 different irrigation canals that come out of the upper Truckee above Reno, and they then go into the south part of the Truckee Meadows. These canals hold 100 CFS max, 50 CFS, 20 CFS, depending on the size. What happens is water comes down when it rains and fills them up. Those things then start to overtop, and you have water going into homes that that never had water into homes before, but because the irrigation ditches are filling up. It's an order of magnitude difference. You always need to keep that in mind. And that's why, these folks that are wanting to maintain pool elevation for storage for irrigation, they give, and this has been my experience, and not because irrigators are difficult to deal with. They've been at it longer than the flood control folks, and so they have this minimum pool elevation, and they don't leave very much room for flood storage. And remember what I said about magnitude? Flood storage needs a huge amount of magnitude in order to be effective. So just keep that in mind as you're planning solutions.
Thank you. Mayor, you saw the pictures. What are we going to do?
Well, the non-expert on the panel here has to look at this maybe from a little different perspective. The risk management perspective that I'm looking at is give us some solutions, and let's rely on the experts to help us determine what those are. And then politically, we've got to sell that. And that's the management that the political side has to deal with. So if it's, if it's raising arrow rock, if it's some combination of other things, then my task, Mayor Veter's task, Mayor Reynolds, Mayor Mitchell down in Star, we've got to get on board with that and work with our experts to establish that public policy. And there are collateral things that we also need to deal with. I think it was mentioned earlier that a flood doesn't just create those that are underwater, or doesn't affect those that are underwater. The Ada County Traffic Control Management apparatus is in the flood zone, the Ada County Highway District. High water would knock out the signal controls in most of the county, Sally, or all the county.
That was a nod yes from Delegate Elf.
That was a nod yes. So all of a sudden you've got a flooding emergency along the river. Your emergency services folks that rely on the Opticon system that turns the lights green for the emergency responders isn't working. You imagine every intersection in town without at a four-way stop indefinitely. You've got sewer and water facilities that are overrun. Your domestic water wells, your generators along the river here are inoperable. The Boise sewer plant is inundated. It gets messy at a broad scale. One of my other part-time hats is I'm the board chairman for the Ada County Emergency Management, City County Emergency Management Board. So this is an area that we really haven't trained for properly either on how we deal with these. So the issue gets big. We can deal with an accident at the airport or a chemical spill at Fairview and Locust Grove, but we haven't dealt with the countywide implications of something as basic as you can't get through an intersection and the inherent issues that would overwhelm our emergency responders. So in the public policy arena, most of these things get back to money. And whether we're looking at regulatory issues where we relieve some of the burden. Steve, I don't know if you can answer this, but what have you spent on dealing with this permitting issue as a professional services provider for Flood 10 in the last year, for example?
It's been 3 years, and it's probably been $50,000.
Oh, please.
Okay, so Steve doesn't remember. The point is, Bill's working with a $230,000 budget, and some measurable component of that is dealing with not the engineering on how to deal with the problem, but getting it through some kind of process. And kudos to Ellen for trying to help us navigate through some of that. But so we've got a regulatory environment that makes it difficult to do some of the maintenance in the river that we could foresee as a problem. We have frankly, a minuscule levy that Drain District number 10 is trying to work with to fund their operation. So we've got this public policy arena that I think is something that we haven't touched on today, but it really is going to take a broad coalition to come up with the money to deal with what the experts ultimately decide we should be doing.
Bill?
Real quickly, my definition of flood is if my house is flooding. If it isn't, nobody cares. Period. And if anything this organization could work on is getting public awareness, because John's not going to get the money needed once the ideas come forward until people realize that we have an issue. About 10 years ago, the dams were in surcharge. There's a huge storm in Portland. We were all gathered together. Our good friend, Mr. Bisterfeld, was either a city councilman or a commissioner. And he turned in very flowering language and said, Clayton, why haven't you got all this gravel out of this river? And I looked at him and I said, there's 50 people in this room. I was getting yelled at by a number of homeowners in December that didn't want us to do any work. And I said, neither one of the 50, there's 2 of us that were in both meetings. So we have all these different conflicting things going on. But somehow we need to make the awareness of people that flooding is not if, but when.
Sally, could you shut down the traffic control system for a couple days? Maybe we get everybody's attention.
And there has been, oh, go ahead.
I'd like to ask Mayor Evans. We've talked a lot about potential solutions. The one that's not been talked about is for municipalities like Garden City to do more of what Boise has done. And that is, for instance, the Boise River System Ordinance has established a 200-foot setback that goes far beyond the FEMA requirement. Part of that provides fish and wildlife habitat, other goals and objectives for the city. But one of the beautiful byproducts of that is flood conveyance. What conversations are you having with your colleagues downriver to explore that possibility?
Well, the honest answer is not. The Garden City is, no pun intended, but the water's kind of gone over the dam for Garden City. There's a stretch on the south side of the river at the west end of town that I don't know, it might be a half a mile or less. And that's the area we have to work with to establish some additional setbacks, and our comp plan is contemplating that. And as those applications begin to come in at some point in the future, not only the setback issue, but the permanent access, which is another issue the drain district has, so they can get to the river to do their maintenance. That's left out of the development picture throughout Boise, Garden City, and on downstream. How do we expect them to get in to do their job? That's a great point. It's one I'll note, probably a discussion I ought to have with Mayor Reynolds and Mayor Mitchell and Eagle and Star.
Thank you.
I think one of the challenges we do have, though, is whether it should have been or not, we do have development right up against the riverbank all through the system. Great comment, though.
Steve?
For the panel, if we put, assuming we could build a dam that could hold the biggest flood, we put a dam up there, and then people feel safer and move in closer to the river. So what kind of mitigation or what kind of vision is out there for we're going to assure people that it's safer to be there if we put more storage?
You do what was just said. You set the floodplain back, and you don't allow development to encroach on that. You just don't.
There was a I think small but significant step forward, and maybe Mary could address this because I'm not an expert on this, but the flood insurance regulations, the bill was amended, and the flood insurance program is going to live on another 5 years, so that's good news for people like me that is a beneficiary of that program. But it is going to, do you want to talk about it, Mary? I mean, part of it is going to be to expand the education of people who are living in those high flood risk areas. And maybe Jay has had to deal with it.
Well, yeah, but there's too much to say, I guess, in this venue.
Right, well, maybe we can bring it up another year, because the rates are going to go up for people like myself, probably people in Garden City, so the rates are going to go up, which hopefully will draw more people's attention to the fact that they do live in a risky area. Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
Well, in Ada County, the penetration of flood insurance is like estimated at somewhere between 16 and 19% of all structures in the map flood hazard area. So there are a lot of people who don't even have flood insurance, who either are choosing not to pay attention to the fact that they're in a risk zone, or their lender didn't or something. But I think going to more actuarial rates, which is where the new flood insurance authorization is going, will get the attention of certain people, but it's still such a small fraction of the population that there needs to be some other mechanism, whether through land use or some other way, to prevent people from doing things that probably are not a good idea.
I'm not sure. Question over here?
Yeah, it's just a comment. It seems like the community has to come to terms with whether, if they're going to go the storage route, whether they want a storage reservoir that does flood control on the side, or a flood control reservoir that does storage on the side. Now, clearly the state's working on the idea of storage first. Actually, I think that's the problem we have now with Lucky Peak. It's storage. That's why nobody has any trouble drafting Lucky Peak empty. It's the fact that it has to fill up with such great reliability that scares everybody. Another thing, and maybe it's the engineer in me too, that I agree with Jay, is the conveyance thing, the working on the floodplain management versus the storage. If you could, two people have talked about sending 10,000 CFS safely through town, well, through town to county. If that could happen, that was actually identified in this 1974 report by IDWR, the one that it says right here, it would be desirable to increase the flow objective below Boise to something in the order of 10,000 CFS. That's come up over and over again. That's 3,500 CFS more than we're currently releasing through town ordinarily. That's 7,000 acre-feet a day. If you could run that, if you could have a plan and a safe conveyance for 30 days, 7,000 acre-feet a day, that's like building a 200,000 acre, it's very simplistic, but it's like building a 200,000 acre-foot flood control reservoir upstream. And you could do it without the reservoir. You wouldn't get any storage, but you could safely get water through town. It would be expensive. His proposal is hugely expensive. But that's another thing people should be thinking about, or a combination of the two.
Well, what would it look like if we get Jay back up here with the computer? How much are we taking out of existing structures to accomplish 10,000 CFS through the city?
It would be interesting, because we looked at 11,000 CFS when Jay was up there, and it didn't show a whole heck of a lot. So, yeah, it's something that it should be part of the plan, and I'm hopeful it will be when the Corps gets to that point. Ellen and company are going to be looking at it, but I think you got to put on your hat. Are we looking at flood control or storage, or what are we going to try to prioritize?
Brian, can you react to some of these accusations that have been directed to IDWR? Is the suggestion accurate that IDWR and the board are really more interested in storage, and that flood control would be just an add-on?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Pat. I appreciate that. I think we would be hopeful that we could accomplish both objectives of reducing flood risk and providing that additional water supply that might be needed as the valley grows into the future. But that's part of what we hope to figure out as we proceed through the feasibility study.
I think it's become just an assumption that many of us have taken as rock solid over the course of the last decade or so, that we're not going to get any more federal dams. Apparently, the department thinks that assumption is wrong. Apparently, the Corps of Engineers thinks that it makes sense to investigate this possibility. How realistic is it that, and this is a political question, how realistic is it that we actually could raise Arrow Rock Dam?
I'm going to answer. I'd like to make a statement on that, and it's important to understand. In 2007, about 45 projects were authorized for construction by the federal government, by Congress. None of those projects have received any allocation. No allotment of money, federal money, has gone to building any of those projects. Part of the reason why I made my statement about the Corps was not to denigrate the Corps or the Bureau for that matter. They're both good organizations. But Congress doesn't authorize money anymore. You've heard the term no new starts. You know what that means? That means if you've never had any construction money, you don't get any. And 2007 isn't a long time, but if you've been relying on a solution that you got authorized in 2007, then you would still be relying on that money because it won't have come, and it's probably not going to come for another 3 to 5 more years. And that's just start money. And that's the reason why I made the statement regarding partnering with the federal government. There are some real good reasons to do so, and there are some reasons not to, and you have to make sure that you are getting what you need out of that. And again, I'm not basing this on my understanding from the 2007 authorization projects, but that was nationwide, not specific to any particular region.
Response?
Sure. We've taken a quick look at some of the major new storage projects that have been built across the western states in the last 15 years or so. And there's probably 18 or 20 major new storage projects. That does include expansions of existing projects, like we're talking about with AeroRock. Out of that 18 or 20, 2 have been federally funded. The rest have been either state or locally funded. So I think that does bear out a little bit about what Jay's talking about.
One final question, right here.
So on the non-structural changes, I've heard everything, basically the whole conversation has been from the dams down. So, Jay, did you guys look above Truckee at what was going on in the upper watershed to look at that? And then also I would like to put it towards the locals that look above the watershed, because the watershed does go above. It goes all the way up to
all the way
Tahoe.
to Tahoe. Actually goes past Tahoe, but Tahoe's a huge regulating reservoir. It puts 8 inches of water over the whole state of California. That's how much water is in Tahoe. To answer the question, yes, it was looked at, and yes, they identified one site that could have been a reservoir, but it was, Mark, help me out, 10, 15 years ago, and they decided that at that time it wasn't feasible to build a structure as large as it would have needed. It would have certainly inundated a large portion of the forest, and there was no thought that could go forward at all.
Did you look at non-structural land use?
No. What I was saying is, to respond to the question, they certainly looked at upstream storage, and they only found one site, and it was nixed because of the fact they didn't think it would get built. We have looked at, our home elevation program is considered a non-structural fix.
But land use? Isn't that what you're questioning?
Yeah.
So land use. So,
Land use in
so
the
to
upper-
make sure that more, so you're not having clear cuts, that you're not having big burn-offs that are causing debris flows and less water.
Remember, we're dealing
absorption.
with California. There's been no clear cuts in California for hundreds of years. But what I'm saying is, land use wouldn't really impact our watershed all that much.
Tahoe is such a...
Because Tahoe is a fairly pristine environment, and even though there are development arguments going on, the amount of people that are there is very much controlled.
I can add to that, Jay, if I like.
Sure.
What was looked at, well, first of all, on the land use side, the majority of the watershed is undeveloped. So the majority of the developments at the bottom end of the watershed doesn't really contribute to the feed flow in the Truckee River. So changing land use in the upper basin wouldn't have any effect on feed flows. The storage that was looked at was not a permanent pool type of reservoir. It was a pass-through. So it would look more like a roadway with a bridge opening, and would only obstruct flows during high flow events. And there were concerns about kayak passage. There was concerns about being able to permit it, because the only viable site was on the California side of the border. The cost was pretty expensive. The Corps didn't really want to go there for a number of reasons. repair criteria. There's also the question of dependability of the timing of peak flows on the main stem with the tributaries and what that would really meant. So there were a whole bunch of reasons, like you said, about why that was discounted. If it were approached as a local project instead of a core project, would it change how that was evaluated? It could. But there were a lot of concerns with that approach. But it is a potentially viable approach, and there was one site on the California side that had enough volume to accomplish that.
Friends, as you can tell, we have assembled a panel of some of the greatest experts in the West to be with you this afternoon, and they have not solved a single problem. But we'll be back at it again with our next monthly program, and hopefully we'll keep chipping away at this. Thank you to the members of our panel. Let's have a hand for them. Let's also thank the sponsors of IEF. Many of you are members of sponsoring organizations. We couldn't do it without you, and we encourage you to keep up those sponsorships and reach out to organizations that you may be a member of and ask them to step up to the plate. We've weathered a very difficult economic storm, and we are still here and going strong thanks to all of you. Now for the fun part, we're going to have